Okay, I've got my daughter's computer because mine doesn't work, so I just got to get this right. I'm going to read a few of my published poems and then a few new ones, and it's been quite interesting for me to see the narrative arc emerge as I've selected them and to see how my mind's been working as reflected through the poems. The first collection, Missing, was a look at mortality and illness. And I'm going to start with something from the second collection, though, because I see with hindsight that that was a way of working out how I fit in, and while still thinking about mortality, looking at how I fit in as reflected by family and the schizophrenic country in which I grew up, South Africa, in the early 60s and 70s. So I'm going to start with a poem from my second collection, A Private Audience, and it's called Labor. It's based on a family story that was passed down about the day my father was born, and it was told to me by my grandmother. Labor. 1931. Epidurals were unheard of in the Eastern Cape. Bossa women rolled mattresses onto mud floor huts, squatted and wept. My grandmother had a bed and a doctor who tutted, "German and Irish, no good will come of this," allowing her hand to grip his as if to tether the cord between a pitching boat and the quay. I'm going to follow that with a poem from my first collection, Missing, because it relates to the man who grew to be my father, but I also like it because, in fact, it's one of the poems I'm most pleased with because it looks, I realize, at what people mean rather than what they say, and how they don't even recognize themselves that what they mean is very different to what they say. This poem was chosen for this year's matric second language exam, and I was very pleased about that too. And the title is something my father always used to say to me, which is, he used to tell me that I needed to realize what life is really like. He was a very avid pigeon racer, and the poem centers around that. What life is really like. You need to toughen up, my father would complain when I was small. I ought to take you to see chickens having their heads chopped off. That'd teach you what life is really like. He'd seek me out when one of his pigeons, crazed for home or mad with terror from a roaming hawk, would tumble into the loft, mutilated by wire or beak. I was the one made to clench my palms round its pumping chest, to keep it still while my father's hairy fingers stitched its garroted throat angrily to rights again. You see, life is a shout for survival, he'd shout, forgetting he was not lecturing his students or giving his inaugural address. You got to roll with the punches. I waited and waited for that bitter roughness to spy me and circle into land. Years and years of flinching anticipation until the day I came home from hospital and my father dressed my wound. Easing with practiced hands the drip from my bulldozed chest, he renewed the plaster in breathing silence, never speaking, never once saying, "Life's a bastard, toughen up." This is one of my newer poems, not yet published. I feel it ties in nicely in the sequence with my father because it was written after my mother died. She was born and grew up in Hermanus and asked that her ashes be scattered there. And this is called Hermanus, December 2022. German and French and Taiwanese tourists are clustered around the old harbor wall to point at disturbances in the water, rippled black lines, frail wisps of mist, a thwacking trident tail. In the bay below us, a mother and calf move in their own time through the swells, south to north. I've come here to scatter my mother's ashes. She was born and raised here, Skinnamalink longlegs roaming the Hungberg mountain, diving in Thicky's pool, hair in ringlets to welcome her father home from war. So much I still want to ask her. Were there so many whales back then? Was the light already so undecided, grey and cream and indigo? Which way should I turn to now? The sea bulges and heaves, and she, who never failed to answer, is obdurate. In the distant blue, mother and calf submit to the language of salt and swell. Their bodies obey the pull of a direction they trust, and they draw my mother down with them, somewhere cool and deep and quiet. I spoke about growing up in South Africa in the 1960s and it being a schizophrenic time. And I think looking back that my second collection is examining that in so many ways. And this poem is written around that. It's called Springtide. We knew about the schools of mullet, the mad waves hurled into the tidal pool. Also rock cod and bluefish, and even some unidentified small fry that nibbled at Ma's toes as she kicked back after her swim one day. This made it into the Daily Dispatch, triggering a long debate. They were piranhas. They were not piranhas. At the time, the townships were burning. Once my brother released a shark pup there and had to fish it out again when old ladies with flowery bathing caps complained like they'd complained about black children in the paddling pool. The waves fumed at the wall and heaved over sand sharks and lobsters, bottom feeders and crabs, stacking them like planes in a holding pattern. Though in the end, I opted for the open sea and pulled even freestyle strokes above the lot of them. Talking about fitting in, this is also a poem about how you fit in. It's called Posse Lessons. Palate and tongue, my mortar and pestle. English lips shift to tut and clickety-click of tongue pounds like whale threshing tail or fat raindrops exploding in bucket made of tin. Oh, 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 knock on wood, let me in. I went to China in 2017 for my son's wedding, and this poem came from there. It's called Ethnic Minorities Singing Joyfully. Ethnic minorities singing joyfully reads the poster at Hong Kong Station. It's printed below a photo of rows of children dressed identically in red, hair tied back, combed down. They open their mouths for the conductor, his raised baton, his chill closed smile. I'll remember them when I wake in Cape Town again, when dawn seeps in and Cape robin and olive thrush and rock doves begin to call, various and unrehearsed. I see Douglas is here somewhere. This is a poem he published in stanzas last year. Again, I think getting into my 60s and looking back at family and the family stories I've heard and how they affected me and my family. So this is based on a story we heard from my grandfather, and it's called Surrender. In 1941, without having fired a single shot, my grandfather was ushered from a dugout in Sidi Rezai to Brook. A German soldier with a gun stood over him. "Kum, kum, Hans," the man shouted, apparently. Pop, as we grandchildren later learned to call him, never spoke about his 4 years as a German POW. Though my mother told me he wept the day he walked her down the aisle towards my father's Kaiser blue stare. This was on the same theme, except it was from the other side of the family, my paternal grandmother. And Douglas and Stanzas also published this. It's called History Lesson. And this, I'd had this memory all the time, but during the time of COVID, it formed itself into a poem. My grandmother was one of 13 children, raised on a farm outside Queenstown, Eastern Cape. At Christmas, she told me, they trekked by ox cart to the coast. A closer youth, no more than a child, was hired from the local village to walk ahead, to lead the oxen across rivers at night, lamp in one hand. In this story, I recognize, in passing, my grandmother as a girl. She's at the back of the wagon, dozing perhaps on a brother's shoulder, or giggling with her sisters. But it's the bearer of the lantern who absorbs me, plodding forward, clicking to the oxen in his mother tongue. It's December 1918, the second year of the Spanish flu. I see a creaking wagon, a tract of darkening felt, and a child raising a lantern to guide oxen through a river at night. Obviously, there was so much damage done in the apartheid years. This is perhaps one that affected us a great deal in our family, and it's called Undone. When snarls clogged up the nylon fishing lines, the two men would sit in the soggy air outside the cottage and untangle them, freed of their normal impatience. The father, his son just back from border duty, surly and remote. The only thing the boy would do willingly was stand on the rocks with his fishing rod, staring out to sea. Heads bent, not speaking to each other. Sometimes they'd make the younger children pull a line while they let the reel spool to test it, crouched in their sagging canvas chairs. Pull, pull, they'd shout. Keep going. Stop. And click, the reel would break the line to a halt. Over 50 types of nylon breaking strain. 10 kilos for a stump nose, 50 for a shad, 100 for a shark, a ragged tooth, and God alone knows how much for a youth of not yet 21. I'm sure a lot of poems are written around airports or train stations, and I've put two of mine together. The first is published in a private audience. This has been anthologized as well. It's called Arrivals. What if heaven's like Cape Town International? Coming out of customs, Dad's waiting at the barricades. A miracle, he caught a flight. Yelling, where the hell have you been? Stabbing a finger at his watch because the red bucky's parked in a loading zone. Beside him, his mother, still on crutches, though no longer in pain. She catches my eye and waves, weeping quietly, while beside her, Pa Else, her second husband, And Walter, her first, no, too complicated. Let's just stick with the scraps of heaven down here, like this businessman off the flight from Brazzaville. Dropping his briefcase to the floor, he crouches to fling his arms wide, braced for someone calling from the crowd. I wrote this poem for the last of my children to leave home, and it's also an airport poem. It's called Go. Go. Planes taxi down the runway and shoot into the air one by one, like boys daring each other off a cliff. No, not just boys. Remember when you were 10 and we hiked in the Drakensberg? We found that waterfall and I stripped to my underclothes, jumped 8 meters down. Little girl, you didn't hesitate, just stripped and plunged straight in after me, your blonde hair blooming up through the foam, your doggy paddle exultant in the icy glimmer. Between the two of us, we know about the cold slice of water or knife, the slow burn of triumph. So let's make this quick. Past mistakes are all mine. Those of the future yours to share or not, as you see fit. For every misstep, there'll be a detour or the exhilaration of an icy plunge. Let's not mention love. I've said all I can say about that. You're not 10 anymore. From here on, you swim your own way out. I promise you it will be worth it. Now go. And once your children leave home, and after your parents have died, memories circle you. This is called the 5th commandment, which is to honor your father and mother. Years after they die, your parents still flurry in your wake as you stalk down a Dublin street at twilight, reminding you to say please and it's a pleasure, to stand up for what's right and sometimes laugh inappropriately. Yet again, they'll tell you there's 2 sides to each story. It's important to seize the day. And of course, how intolerant you are, how that always screwed things up for you. Decades after you last saw them, you'll find your parents idling beside you at the post office queue or in the coffee aisle at Claremont Pick and Pay in search of Colombian decaf. They're the low laughter when you trip over a step in Belfast, the cool palm on your forehead during a night of fever and despair in a hotel room in Beijing. One way or another, your parents are forever falling into step beside you, sometimes singly, sometimes one at each elbow. Old age isn't for sissies, they murmur. What can't be cured must be endured. And you begin to see, though they weren't always right, sometimes they were, and how they can still teach you things, how to listen, how to stay quiet, how to grow smaller and even disappear. This was written for my mother-in-law, who worked so hard all her life and had a cruel and drawn out ending to that life. It's called Time, but it's spelled T-H-Y-M-E. Time. She heard it helped longevity, so each morning she chewed a sprig. She strewed it over homegrown lamb and peas and garnished the ice cream made with berries from her orchard. She scented it in potpourris that sat in judgment beside the pristine beds of overnight guests who could only share a room if they were married. There will be time to rest when you die, she'd say, pillowing a cheek against work-worn hands to demonstrate. Time replied, be careful what you wish for, and stretched her skin transparent over her bones, and wore to opaque her eyes and mind. She shrank to a baby in his arms, while otters and rats and snakes devoured the brimming orchard, and the summer garden grew crowded with seeds spread by sparrows, hawks, and doves, a bounty of illicit lust. Then, because she could not, we begged time to show mercy, to push on so that we might remember her as she once was, young and busy, and even then, like all of us, dying. The last poem is also unpublished, and it's yet again about my parents. It's called Table Mountain. I like to imagine it was flattened by giant hands that measured with the spirit level, as my father once did, that an ogre who sweated and swore like him raged up a southeaster at the sandstone's refusal to obey. I like to think of Devil's Peak as one of my mother's misshapen cakes, iced in joyful compensation with creamy clouds, that the folds of green forest below were gathered and hemmed by hands such as hers, stitched to fit loosely around boulders that rise, dripping with lichen, like whales from the Atlantic Sea. I like to dream that she blithely ignores my father's howl to train her loving gaze down to where forest and greenery stop and traffic and hunger and gunshots begin. Oh, may she in some magical way continue to gather arum lilies and ericas and protea and to weep for the children from Makaza to Manenberg. I think that's it. I thought that was enough.
Thank you.
I can't hear anyone.
Thank you. That was fantastic. I'm sure we were all hoping for some more.
Well, I can read one or two more.
Okay, fantastic, cool.
If there's still time. I don't know which one to pick now. Oh, this is quite a nice one. It's called Nothing Ever Happened in King Williamstown. That was where I spent my adult, I did my high schooling. Some nights when this city won't let me sleep, I like to remember how I once squeezed a trigger and launched a Coke tin into the humid air. First shot. Scene, backyard of our house in Albert Road. Dad, Basil the bank manager, the Coke tin, a pellet gun. I enter and ask to have a go. Dad says, "Pull yourself together, Basil, man. This is no laughing matter." As I reach for the rifle, Dad always says, "Listen, Basil, don't give her the gun before you set the target up. That daughter of mine has a very strange sense of humor." Might be any new ones. This is for my children. I'll make this the last one. Sylvia Plath wrote a poem when she was pregnant with her son, and she called it Ure, and it's the most joyous and delightful description of the baby that she was carrying in her womb. Everybody thinks she was always so depressing, but she wrote some marvelously joyful poems as well. So I turned that around and decided I'll write one called I'm fixed fast, your statue of liberty, hollowed into corridors for you to race through. Lights swarm at each window. I'm anxious as ants, peering as meerkats do, persistent as a cinema usher, torch probing for your face, oh little stowaway out at sea. Larger than love and fucked up as family, older than a black and white movie, crumple shadowed, patient as cement, numbered like 354 steps. You'll climb each one to my heart, then head. My crown lights up. Come home. I'd just like to finish by putting a word in for Dryad Press and all the wonderful work they do for poetry in this country. And they've just launched Peter Anderson's collection of poetry. Michelle, who is the editor of Dryad Press, has asked me to tell you as well that she's offering a special discount on my two collections at the moment. So thank you for listening, and have a look at the Dryad Press website. And I'm happy to answer any questions if you want.
Fantastic. Thank you again, Beverly. Yeah, so if anyone has any questions or comments, you can just raise your hands in the reactions tool. Perhaps I could go first. I'll put my camera on. I'm quite interested. Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, can we? I just feel like, can we have a round of applause?
Of course. Sorry. Yes.
So nice.
Yes. Thank you, Jacques.
Thank
you.
It's all the hands. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacques. Yes, I found your poems deeply personal in a kind of tribunal sense, as individual acts of homage almost, and also anthropological. But I suppose I'm mostly wanted to ask you about the poetic inquiry, how you use poetry in that process of biography, in memorializing. How has it helped you in that sense?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and it has helped a lot. I've forgotten who it was who said, out of the quarrels with ourselves, we make poetry. It could have been Yeats, but perhaps somebody can help me with that. So, yeah, something personal that begins as a quarrel with oneself, wondering about life, about meaning or relationships, but to start that conversation and to start with expressing it, but move from it being my question to being a question that maybe you can relate to as well. And then from that to develop it to us, because I think one has to move beyond the personal and try to make it something human that can pull people in and relate to the human race.
Thank you. Any questions, comments?
Hi, Douglas.
Go for it, please.
I was, thank you for the reading. I was struck by the first poem that you wrote to your parents, the Pick and Pay one.
Mm.
How I could actually see the inside of Pick and Pay, and I could see that copy on the shelf. And I think, in a way, what came to mind at the time was William Carlos Williams's edict, no ideas but in things.
Yes.
And how that particular evocation of your parents, with its lovely, rich tapestry of concrete images, is entirely sufficient without ever saying it, without ever stating it. It acts as a emissary for the love that you felt for your parents. That's what comes through the poem, loud and clear and rich, without ever saying it. That's a lovely art of poetry.
Thank you. I'm very pleased that you saw that, because as you know, one has to be brutally frank and honest if one is to write poetry, but to have that filter through all the humanity, that there was a great deal of love there, means a lot to me.
Thank you, Douglas. Jacques?
I don't really have a question so much. I just want to say I was incredibly moved by your reading. I felt often quite near the end of a poem, you know, I would be listening to one of the poems and they would be wonderful, and then right near the end there would be suddenly another dimension. There would be a surprise, and it's always wonderful. I mean, I love the endings of, you know, your endings are wonderful. You know, you really have a sense of an ending. I absolutely loved listening to you. And it was Yeats, by the way, who said that.
I didn't hear the last bit, sorry, Jacques.
And you were right, it was Yeats who said that about.
Oh, was it Yeats?
Yes.
Yes. Well, thank you, Jacques. As you would know, endings are very difficult, and I often struggle with them. I'll often have the poem, and then we'll struggle with an ending. It might take years, and then sometime it'll suddenly fit in. That ending will come up. So thank you.
You tend to start in the middle as well.
Yes, yeah. Often I'll start writing, and then I'll often just cut out the first verse, because the real beginning is halfway in.
That's useful. I've heard that once before and I forgot it.
Fanula set us a wonderful exercise once, and in fact I've got a poem titled that in my first collection called "It's Difficult to Explain." And that's a wonderful way in, when one is trying to write something, to just say to yourself, well, it's difficult to explain, and then suddenly you find yourself explaining it.
Yes, that's wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Lugubrious visage.
Not now. You're not lugubrious now. I can't hear you.
It's the
There we go.
Was there another question?
He is talking, but
okay, fine. Okay.
I can't hear him. Still can't hear. That's better. No, still can't hear you.
Yeah, it could be a setting on your device. I can come back. Was there another question? Oh, you can type it, yes. Oh, there we go. There we are.
Am I heard?
Yes,
you are now.
That's wonderful. I'm so sorry about the technological difficulties there. A very good evening to everybody. First and foremost, I'd like to thank both Madame Rycroft as well as Red Wheelbarrow for such a wonderful gathering tonight and a beautiful, beautiful reading. I must confess, this is the very first time I have had the honor of being in the presence of your poetry as well as your persona, and I found it absolutely fascinating and exquisite. I tend to agree with the comments before me about your acute acknowledgement and writing about the most trivial things that people tend to look over or not even realize in their daily life. And I must say, in particular, that your poem Time tended to resonate with me the most. It is one of the most haunting poems I've heard in a very long time, pun intended there. And I also tend to find myself relating to another line that you wrote in your very last one, and Sylvia Plath does come to mind, fucked up as family, because I certainly have a lot that I can talk about there, but I won't bore you all with that. So those are just a couple of comments that I've picked up right off of the bat, and I think it's so very important to have somebody who is coming with this unique lens that you have and commenting on such uniquely South African things, yet at the same time universal. I really believe it's visceral in what it is. And I'd like to end with a question and just ask, we've already had something regarding your approach to writing poems, but I'd like to ask a little bit, perhaps because we're focusing on days gone by here. What was it in the water, so to speak? What was it in the atmosphere that got you to pick up pen and pad and start this spiritual journey that, you know, is just so fascinating?
Well, I think from the moment I saw letters, I think I just fell in love with words. I was always in love with words. So I was writing from a very early age and keeping diaries and so on. And it was just something in me that couldn't be stopped, and a force. But certainly when I fell ill in my 30s and was quite ill, dangerously ill, I was at a point where I had nothing left to lose. I was very afraid of being laughed at or scorned. Everybody is. I think it's you make yourself very vulnerable, but I did find myself in a position where I felt I had nothing left to lose. It was now or never, and I'm in that sense very grateful for that illness, because it liberated me, and then I was very fortunate in being able to survive enough to use that voice. So it gave me confidence to project that voice out. And I must say that Fanula Darling helped me a great deal. I went to a poetry course of hers, and she gave me the skills, but also the encouragement. It's a frightening thing, putting your life out there, but it can be quite magical as well.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And I think I should conclude in saying that my real name is Sean, as opposed to Lugubrious Visage.
Yeah, I think that's much better, Sean, than lugubrious. You're not at all lugubrious.
Not at the moment.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sean.
Yeah, maybe we all continue to be fascinated with words. I wonder if there were any more questions or comments. I'm mindful of time, your time particularly.
Carol?
Ben, are you speaking? I don't think so. Okay. Thank you, Beverly. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your craft. Thank you for your stories. We hope to hear and read more of your work. I'm going to stop the recording, but please continue to chat. We'll start the open mic in 10 minutes. Okay.
Thanks everybody at Red Wheelbarrow for inviting me, and thanks to everybody who attended. It's lovely to see your faces.
Yes. Take care. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Just to say, I'm going to the recording of this reading will be made available to everyone on the mailing list. So there's an opportunity for you to share it at some point. Thanks.